Before a single bite even touched his lips, he already knew something was different. The smell alone stopped him mid-sentence. It was delicate, almost invisible. Nothing like the loud, punchy aromas he had grown up chasing in a family kitchen filled with garlic, vinegar, and bagong. He had lived his entire life eating food that announced itself the moment the pot was opened. Food that demanded your attention. Food that told a story the second it hit the air. And here he was, sitting in front of a spread of Japanese dishes, wondering how something so quiet could possibly satisfy a stomach trained for chaos. What followed over the next few hours changed the way he thought about food, culture, identity, and what it truly means to feel at home in a bowl. To understand what happened that day, you first have to understand where this young Filipino man came from. His name was Marco, a 26-year-old from Bulacan, a province just north of Metro Manila, where the food is heavy, the portions are generous, and rice is not just a side dish, but the foundation of every single meal. Marco had grown up eating sinigang on rainy days, warming his hands on a bowl of pork sour broth, packed with kangkong and taro. He had learned to love adobo, not just as a dish, but as a ritual, watching his lola slowly braise chicken thighs in a mixture of vinegar, soy sauce, bay leaves, and garlic, until the whole house smelled like Sunday. He had eaten lechon at every baptism, birthday, and barangay fiesta he could remember, admiring the way the crackling golden skin shattered on the first bite. Food for Marco was not a quiet thing. It was celebration. It was love made edible.
He had traveled to Japan on a work assignment, part of a small team from his company sent to collaborate with a manufacturing partner in Osaka for 3 weeks. He had never been outside the Philippines before, and the first thing that struck him when he arrived was not the buildings or the trains or the fashion, it was the food stalls. He walked past them on the first evening, watching salarymen standing at tiny counters, eating in near silence, heads bowed over steaming bowls of ramen. There was an almost ceremonial quality to the way they ate, and Marco, who had always eaten dinner surrounded by noise, laughter, and the sound of a television in the next room, found it both fascinating and slightly unnerving. He pulled out his phone, opened a video recording, and started narrating what he was seeing for his followers back home. Nobody could have predicted what would come next.
The first dish he tried was ramen from a small shop tucked into a narrow alley near the Shinsaibashi area of Osaka. He had tasted ramen before, the kind sold in Filipino malls, thick with toppings and drenched in a broth that tasted more of sweetness than depth. This was nothing like that. The broth was tonkotsu, made from pork bones that had been simmered for hours until the collagen dissolved completely into the liquid, turning it creamy and rich without a single drop of cream ever being added. Marco took his first spoonful and paused. He looked into the camera and said something that would become the most shared moment of the entire video. He said in his thick Tagalog accented English that it tasted like someone had been thinking about this bowl of soup for 30 years. The comment section exploded. What Marco was reacting to without knowing it was the Japanese culinary philosophy known as shokunin kishitsu, or the spirit of the craftsman. In Japan, chefs often dedicate their entire lives to mastering a single dish. There are ramen shops in Tokyo and Osaka that have been perfecting the same recipe for 3 generations. The concept is rooted in Zen Buddhist principles that value repetition, patience, and the pursuit of quiet excellence over showmanship. For someone like Marco, raised in a culture where cooking is communal and instinctive, passed down through feel and memory rather than measurement and method, this was a revelation. Filipino food is built on warmth and generosity. Japanese food is built on precision and devotion. Both are expressions of love, just spoken in completely different languages.
The second dish placed in front of him was sushi, specifically omakase-style sushi at a modest counter restaurant where the chef, a man in his early 60s named Tanaka-san, prepared each piece by hand and slid it across the pale wood counter without ceremony. Marco had eaten sushi before. He had eaten it at mall food courts in Manila, where it came with spicy mayo on top and was sometimes rolled with mango. This was a different experience entirely. The rice had been seasoned with a vinegar mixture the chef had adjusted that morning based on the humidity in the air. The fish was cut with a blade so sharp it barely seemed to touch the flesh. Marco picked up a piece of fatty tuna, placed it on his tongue, and sat completely still for several seconds. He then looked at the camera and said absolutely nothing. The silence lasted 8 seconds. That 8 seconds got nearly 2 million views on its own.
What made that silence so powerful was everything it communicated to the people watching. Filipinos who had traveled, Filipinos who had never left their province, food lovers across Southeast Asia, and curious viewers from Japan and the United States all understood in that wordless moment that something genuine had just happened. Food content on social media is often performative, filled with exaggerated reactions and dramatic exclamations designed to manufacture emotion. Marco's silence was the opposite. It was honest. It was the face of someone whose entire understanding of what food could be had just shifted quietly beneath them. The internet, which rarely rewards subtlety, rewarded it that day. He moved next through dishes that were new to him, but rooted in the same rice-based, umami-forward culinary tradition that actually connects Filipino and Japanese food in ways most people never consider. Both cultures built their cuisines on rice as the central element. Both developed deep flavors through fermentation, using ingredients like miso and bagong to add complexity. Both prized fresh seafood and developed sophisticated ways of preserving and presenting it. Marco began noticing these parallels as he ate, pointing them out in his video with growing excitement. He held up a piece of nori and said it reminded him of the dried seaweed his lola used to put in her ginataang bilo-bilo. He tasted a dipping broth made with kombu and said it was like sinigang that had decided to whisper instead of shout. The dish that made him cry was Tamago Gohan, which in English is simply egg over rice. It is one of the most humble foods in Japan, eaten by millions of people every morning as a breakfast staple. You take a raw egg, crack it into a bowl of freshly steamed Japanese rice, add a few drops of soy sauce, and mix it until the egg coats every grain with a silky, pale yellow richness. That is it. No cooking, no technique, beyond the quality of the rice and the freshness of the egg. Marco tried it at a small guest house where he was staying, prepared by the elderly woman who ran the place. She brought it out for him on a tray with a bowl of miso soup and some pickled vegetables. And something about the simplicity of it, the quiet care and how it was arranged, the fact that this woman had gotten up early to prepare this specific meal for a stranger who was far from home, broke something open in him. He said on camera, voice cracking, that it reminded him of his mother making sinigang for him before school when he was small. Fried garlic rice with a fried egg on top, simple and unpretentious and completely saturated with love. He said that he had not expected to feel homesick while eating Japanese food. He said that he thought food this different from what he knew would feel foreign and alienating, but instead it felt like a conversation between two people who did not speak the same language, but somehow understood each other perfectly. That moment, which lasted less than 3 minutes in the full video, became the emotional anchor around which the entire story turned. Comments poured in from Filipinos living abroad, from Japanese viewers who had eaten Tamago Gohan since childhood without ever considering how profound it might feel to a stranger, from people all over the world who said it reminded them of the simple meals their own parents had made them. The video continued as Marco explored more of Osaka's food culture over the following days. He visited a traditional izakaya, which is a casual Japanese drinking establishment that serves small plates of food alongside drinks, and found it surprisingly similar in atmosphere to the Carinderias he had grown up eating at back in Bulacan. The setup was different, the food was different, the drinks were different, but the function was the same. It was a place where ordinary people came after work to sit close together, relax, and eat food that did not demand anything from them except their presence. He ordered yakitori, grilled chicken skewers seasoned simply with salt or tare sauce, and found himself thinking of the inasal he had eaten at roadside stalls back home. The smell of the burning coals, the way the chicken skin crisped and darkened and the juice ran down your fingers when you bit in. What Marco kept coming back to in his narration was the idea of familiarity within strangeness. He was eating food that was almost entirely new to him, yet beneath the unfamiliar flavors and presentations, he kept finding something he recognized. Both Filipino and Japanese cuisines share a deep respect for the main ingredient being allowed to speak for itself. Filipino kare-kare, a rich peanut-based stew with oxtail and vegetables, shares a visual and textural similarity with Japanese curry that surprised him when he tried a bowl of katsudon, a fried pork cutlet served over rice in a sweet soy and egg sauce. He said the sweetness reminded him of Jollibee spaghetti, which made the Japanese viewers in the comment section very curious and slightly alarmed, and which launched an entirely separate thread of conversation that kept people engaged on the video for days after it was posted.
He spent one afternoon at the famous Kuromon Ichiba market in Osaka, often called Osaka's Kitchen, where vendors have been selling fresh seafood, produce, and prepared foods for nearly 200 years. Walking through the stalls, Marco noticed things that paralleled the wet markets he had grown up visiting with his grandmother every Saturday morning in Bulacan. The vendors called out to passers-by with the same energy he remembered. The crabs were packed in the same kind of overflowing containers, and the smell of the sea was just as immediate and honest. He bought a piece of fresh sea urchin served on a small square of rice and ate it standing in the middle of the market aisle. And the look on his face was the same look you give something when it has rendered all of your previous opinions about a subject completely obsolete.
The cultural gap between Japanese and Filipino food culture, when you look closely, is not as wide as the surface differences suggest. Yes, Japanese food tends towards subtlety, minimalism, and restraint, while Filipino food tends towards abundance, bold flavor combinations, and generous portions. Japanese dining culture places enormous emphasis on presentation and the visual arrangement of food as an expression of respect for the diner, while Filipino food culture places its emphasis on volume, on filling the table so completely that no one can possibly leave hungry, which is its own form of respect. But both traditions ultimately communicate the same thing: that the act of preparing food for another person is one of the most direct forms of care that exists in human civilization. Marco understood this by the end of his trip, and he said so in the closing minutes of the video, in a way that resonated with people far beyond the food content community.
In the final segment of what became a nearly 40-minute video, Marco sat in a small park near Dotonbori, the famous entertainment and dining district along the Dotonbori River, and spoke directly to the camera without editing. He talked about how he had expected Japan to feel like another world, and instead found a mirror. He said that watching a Japanese chef spend 20 years perfecting a single dish made him think about his lola, who had made the same pot of sinigang every week for 60 years and had never once considered it anything other than ordinary, never imagined that the muscle memory in her hands was its own form of mastery. He said that the best meal he had eaten in Japan was the one that made him cry, not because the food was extraordinary by any global standard, but because a stranger had made it for him with care in the early morning hours and placed it in front of him without expecting anything in return. That, he said, is the same in every language. The video went up on a Thursday evening Manila time and began gaining traction within hours. Filipino viewers shared it for the food content, for Marco's personality, and for the emotional moment with the Tamago Gohan. Japanese viewers found it through the algorithm and shared it because watching someone experience their everyday food as something remarkable is its own kind of moving experience. Food creators in the United States, Australia, and the United Kingdom shared clips. A Japanese food culture magazine featured the video in a social media roundup. A Philippine national newspaper wrote a short piece about it. By the end of the first week, it had cleared 1 million views, and the comment section had become one of those rare internet spaces where people were actually kind to each other, swapping memories of their own mother's cooking, recommending dishes for Marco to try on his next visit, and arguing passionately about whether Filipino sinigang or Japanese miso soup deserved more global recognition. What the video accomplished beyond entertainment was a quiet but meaningful act of cultural connection. In a media landscape where food content often leans on spectacle, on the most extreme dishes, the most dramatic reactions, the most grotesque or unusual ingredients, Marco's video succeeded by doing the opposite. It leaned into sincerity. It found the human being at the center of the eating experience and let that person be genuinely moved without performing that emotion for the camera. Viewers could tell the difference. The algorithm, which is often accused of rewarding noise, rewarded the silence in front of the sushi counter. It rewarded the cracking voice over the Tamago Gohan. It rewarded the 20-minute market walk, where Marco talked about his Lola as if she were standing beside him. The response from the Japanese online community was particularly interesting. Many Japanese viewers wrote in the comments that they had never seen their own everyday food through foreign eyes before, and that watching Marco discover the depth in something as basic as Tamago Gohan made them see it differently too. One comment that got thousands of likes read, translated roughly, that they had eaten this rice and egg dish every morning since childhood and had never once thought of it as something worth marveling at, and that watching this Filipino man cry over it made them want to call their own parents and thank them. The video had achieved something that most content creators spend years trying to manufacture and rarely find, which is genuine emotional resonance that travels across cultural and language barriers without losing anything in translation. Marco returned to the Philippines 3 weeks after his first video went live, and by then the original upload was sitting at over 8 million views, with a comment section still actively growing. He was not a food critic, he was not a trained filmmaker or a professional content creator. He was a young man from Bulacan who had brought a phone to Japan and pointed it at his honest face while eating. And somehow that was enough, more than enough, to remind millions of people that food is never really just about taste. It is about memory and identity, about the invisible thread that connects the meal in front of you to every meal you have ever eaten that mattered. It is about the fact that whether you are sitting in a narrow ramen shop in Osaka or pulling up a plastic chair at a Carinderia in Bulacan, somebody made that food thinking of you, and that thought alone, expressed through heat and seasoning and time, is what fills you in the end.